According to the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the transportation sector is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, making up around 27% of emissions, closely followed by electricity at 25% and industry at around 24%, all primarily from burning fossil fuels. Through these practices, we are largely dependent on fossil fuel combustion for cars, trains, ships, planes, and trucks. And why is that? Well, in the United States, our cities are largely centered around road infrastructure. Since the passage of the Federal Aid Highway Act by President Eisenhower in 1956, which called for the construction of a 46,000-mile highway system across the country, our infrastructure has largely been shaped in order to cater to this prioritization of roads and automobiles. Prior to this, our infrastructure was largely based around railroads, with most of our shipping and long-distance transportation being done by trains. However, since the development of our highway systems and the rising popularity of the automobile, American cities have been constructed around and integrated with road infrastructure. But it doesn't have to be this way. In the Netherlands, many cities are designed around prioritizing bike, walking, and public transportation infrastructure, minimizing the amount of cars on the roads and allowing for multiple transportation options to get around. The funny thing is, after World War II, the Netherlands reshaped its infrastructure to be more automobile-focused, with an assistance from the United States through the Marshall Plan, which provided funds and resources in the rebuilding efforts of Europe following the war. Despite this effort, much of the country largely opposed the developments, especially after seeing the significant rise in deaths due to accidents between vehicles and pedestrians. This gave rise to the Stop the Kindermoord movement, which translates to Stop the Children Murder movement, which aimed to reverse this growing automobile dependence after many deaths, including many children among them. This movement saw success in halting this mass construction of road infrastructure and instead pushed for development of biking and walking infrastructure, which was largely supported by the country's oil crisis in 1973, making driving much more difficult to afford. This resulted in the large biking networks we see in the Netherlands today. But how do you transition from an automobile-based city structure to more of a bike and pedestrian-focused one without having to halt the economy or transportation? Well, there are many ways we could transition. Multiple strategies have been used to shift infrastructure towards a biking and pedestrian focus. First off, it's important to acknowledge that simply attempting to push for a cultural shift doesn't necessarily work unless the necessary infrastructure is put in place to support the switch. It is a lot harder for people to switch from driving to biking if there isn't a network for bikes to travel on, or to switch to public transportation if there isn't an efficient and convenient network to take you where you need to go, or to walk if everything's way too far away. Everything comes down to city design. To tackle this, the Netherlands decided to take a more transitional approach, closing a few cities to cars and converting them into walking and biking streets. Then they began to expand this practice over time, eventually resulting in a large bike network that is present today. Another strategy was taken by Oslo, a city in Norway, which realized that outright banning cars would be far too controversial. So instead, they began to eliminate the majority of parking places available on streets, with an exception for electric vehicles and disabled drivers and deliveries. This strategy made it a lot more inconvenient to drive and made it much more convenient to walk or bike, which resulted in a significant switch in transportation preference. While doing this, these countries also significantly invested in the development of public transportation infrastructure, like buses, trolleys, and railway. This allowed for alternative transportation to be more easily adopted by the masses. In the Netherlands, people have a variety of public transportation options that come so often that there's little to no worry when missing a bus or a train, because you can just go on the next one. Often buses have their own lanes, and that allows them to stay pretty consistently on schedule. While these successes in the adoption of alternative transportation are significant, they're also largely due to the pre-existing conditions of the areas in which they were developed. For example, in the Netherlands, their topography is fairly flat, and that makes it pretty easy for biking and walking transportation to make sense, unlike other areas that might have more elevation changes, making it a bit more difficult. On top of that, medium density housing and mixed zoning laws are very common in the Netherlands. This allows for grocery stores and commercial buildings and housing to all coexist within the same neighborhoods. This makes walking and biking transportation much more convenient. So the question is, would it be possible to do this in the US? Well, sadly, as the answer often ends up being, it's complicated. There are a lot of barriers preventing the widespread adoption of walking and biking cities in the United States, the largest of which is the issue of zoning laws. See, in the United States, we limit what types of buildings can be built in certain areas through zoning laws. For example, we often designate certain zones for single-family homes, which restricts the presence of commercial buildings in the area and restricts developers to building detached single-family homes with driveways and yards. This in turn spreads out the population and makes it much more likely that people will live far away from work, stores, schools, and parks. By spreading out the population of the city, we're making it almost impossible for cities to be walkable or bikeable. This is causing huge problems with housing here in California, where cities like San Jose consist of almost entirely single-family sprawl, despite its high demand for affordable housing. These zoning laws make it increasingly difficult to develop larger duplexes or complexes for people to live on, unlike the Netherlands, where mixed-use zoning is pretty prevalent and allows for more balanced use of the lands and more practical land use and city design. The other large boundary is primarily cultural, as the United States has developed quite an obsession with cars, with a large cultural focus on individual freedom and independence. On top of this, cars are also largely seen as a part of oneself and even a status symbol. This necessary culture shift away from cars in order to encourage the adoption of alternative transportation is an incredibly difficult feat in the United States. However, it would not be impossible. In fact, the best strategy would simply be develop first and people will follow. This has been seen on a smaller scale in the United States, especially here in California. In Oakland, California, for example, on Telegraph Avenue, one of the car lanes was replaced with a bike lane, which was also protected by a parking lane, with buffers in between to make sure that there's enough room for you to open the door and not hit a biker. This not only saw an increase in the usage of bikes, but also a decrease in the rate of speeding due to the presence of the bike lanes in the first place. Another example is right here in Santa Barbara, where we have not only developed bike lanes along the coast, but we've also converted State Street from a road into a walking and biking street. This has not only benefited pedestrians and bikers, but has also significantly helped restaurants and businesses boost their revenues following the lockdowns from the COVID pandemic. It's also resulted in an increase in the amount of people deciding to walk or bike rather than drive. While these small successes show big promise, they still lack the scale of biking networks or walkable cities that we see in many places around Europe, such as the Netherlands. However, the potential is still definitely there. Cities in California are densely populated enough to justify changing to walking and biking cities with public transportation support for longer distances. The problem with cars is that they just take up a lot of space, and they require cities to invest significant amounts of money into developing large freeways, parking structures, and constant road maintenance. Overall, these result in very high costs to cities and to the drivers themselves. On top of that, gas prices have increased significantly, making it much less affordable to regularly commute by car in big cities. At the moment, the new car market and even the used car market is incredibly inflated and making it very difficult to buy a car at the moment. On top of that, regular maintenance costs on cars add up rather quickly over time. Then you have the factor of paying for parking and gas, and overall, cars become a very high expense. Yet due to the lack of infrastructure for alternative transportation, people are often forced to invest a significant amount of money into cars. To shift away from this reliance on cars, Californian cities can invest significantly in the development of bus infrastructure and railways. To avoid problems with land usage, they could intersect pre-existing highways and construct tunnels underground, as done with the Bay Area Rapid Transit Network. Cities could also transition away from cars by gradually closing down streets and converting them into walking and biking streets. In order to construct biking networks, they would likely need to reconstruct the roads themselves. This could be done when roads need to be repaved or when sewer lines need to be replaced, as in these instances, the roads would need to be removed anyways. Overall, doing this through transitional means would allow for much more of a gradual shift rather than a shock to the system. It would allow for it to be adopted over time rather than closing down the city in order to completely reconstruct the roadways, which would likely cause a huge outrage. The solution wouldn't have to be to completely eradicate the car. we still have promises with the electric car and ride-sharing apps to be able to do that somewhat sustainably. Rather, we can use the existing infrastructure to renovate and allow more options for transportation. Create biking networks alongside streets, create rails alongside highways and underground, create walking zones and highly commercial areas where it'd be more advantageous to both consumers and businesses. These solutions are not impossible, they just require funding, political will, and a vision of what our cities could be.